Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Glad to be here, diving into this one with you.
Yeah, this is going to be a really fascinating deep dive today, because today we are looking at this 1,400-year-old warning about a fire that rises over the hearts.
Right, which sounds pretty intense right out of the gate.
It really does. Like, you might hear that and immediately think it's just, ancient mythology about the afterlife, a standard fiery threat to just keep people in line. But as we're going to discover in today's sources, it's actually this chillingly accurate diagnosis of, well, the modern hedonic treadmill, like the epidemic of burnout and the psychological torment of endless greed.
It really is. But before we get too deep into that, I think we need to set the stage. Because these texts, they carry deep religious significance for billions of people. And they touch on some really intense historical conflicts.
Right.
So I want to clarify for you, the listener, exactly what our framework is today. We're looking at chapters 104 through 114 of the Qur'an. But we are not here to endorse specific theological claims or, take sides in ancient political or religious disputes.
Exactly.
Our purpose is just to impartially explore what the text actually says, to try and understand the really volatile historical context it was born into, and then extract the philosophical and practical ideas that can be applied to your modern life.
Which is such an important distinction. And to find that practical wisdom, we first have to identify the beating heart of the message. We have to look at the core arguments these texts are making about human nature itself.
Yeah.
Because the sources we have, they suggest that the very first target of this text wasn't merely the theological beliefs of the ancient Arabians, but their bank accounts.
Oh, absolutely.
Specifically, this illusion of material security. The text takes direct aim at a specific type of person who amasses wealth and just considers it their ultimate provision against the future.
It is a devastating critique of the psychology of hoarding. The commentary in our sources points out that this individual operates under this huge delusion.
What kind of delusion?
The delusion that their wealth is somehow going to make them immortal, or at the very least immune to the casualties of fortune.
Right.
We have to remember that in the 7th century, the society being addressed was fiercely mercantile. Success was measured in camels, in trade routes, in silver.
Oh, for sure. It was all about the tangible assets.
Right. And the text is asserting that material wealth is just this hollow shield against life's ultimate realities. You can't buy your way out of mortality, and you just cannot hoard enough resources to insulate yourself from, well, the human condition.
But wait, isn't that a bit of a universally accepted trope, though? Like, every major philosophy says money can't buy happiness. What makes this specific text's approach to wealth hoarding so unique?
What makes it unique is how it inextricably links the hoarding of wealth to the microscopic, everyday treatment of the most vulnerable people in society.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Well, the text doesn't just say, wealth is bad because it corrupts your soul. It argues that your grand philosophical or religious claims are entirely invalidated by how you handle your basic household goods.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah. In the chapter titled The Alms, the text presents a profoundly radical idea for its time and place. It states that claiming to be righteous or diligently performing your prayers is completely nullified if you treat orphans harshly or if you refuse basic neighborly help.
Nullified? That seems like an incredibly high bar. So if you're out there performing all the right public rituals, but you are rude to a neighbor in need, the text considers your entire belief system void.
Absolutely void. It's striking. The text explicitly warns those who are unmindful of the true spirit of their prayers, who only do good to be seen by others, and who withhold what is called al-ma'un.
Al-ma'un. Okay, what does that term actually mean in practice? Because when we hear the word alms in English, we usually think of, giving a $20 bill to a charity or dropping coins in a bucket outside a grocery store.
Right. But al-ma'un doesn't refer to massive philanthropic checks or building a wing on a hospital. The source commentary points out it signifies small, seemingly insignificant household necessities.
Like what?
Things like a cooking pot, a pinch of salt, a bucket of water, or even just a coal to start a fire.
Oh, I see. So it's really about the micro-interactions.
Exactly.
So true morality isn't proven when you're standing on a stage receiving some award for your charity. It's proven when your neighbor knocks on your door asking to borrow a hammer, and you decide in that split second whether to be generous or stingy.
You nailed it. It's the assertion that faith and social action are totally inseparable. If your grand philosophy doesn't translate into basic kindness and sharing small necessities with the vulnerable,
then your philosophy is basically bankrupt.
yes, it argues that true character is revealed precisely in the unglamorous, unseen moments of daily life.
But the text also pairs this extreme, on-the-ground social responsibility with something incredibly abstract, doesn't it? The commentary highlights a chapter titled The Unity, which distills the concept of the divine into this absolute, uncompromising oneness, totally independent of all things.
It does, yeah.
So why pair the micro-level sharing of a cooking pot with the macro-level theology of absolute cosmic unity? Those seem so far apart.
Because one is the anchor for the other. In a society that worships dozens of fragmented idols, and frankly, in a modern society that worships the fragmented idols of wealth, status, and tribal allegiance,
right,
this text demands reliance on an ultimate singular truth. The Arabic word used in this context is as-samad.
As-samad.
Yeah, and the commentary explains this means the Lord to whom recourse is had in every need, the one who is independent of everything while everything else depends entirely on him.
So it's about not relying on fleeting things.
Exactly. It's about finding a central, immovable spiritual center rather than relying on the fleeting idols of the world, like wealth or social standing.
Let me see if I can map this out with an analogy just to make sure we're getting this. If we view a person's character like the architecture of a house, this idea of absolute unity, this as-samad, is the load-bearing foundation.
Okay, I like that.
It has to be solid, singular, and immovable. But the social equity, the sharing of the alman, that is the actual structure where people live. It's the shelter you provide for others.
That's a great way to put it.
Because you can't have a house without a foundation, obviously. But a foundation without a house doesn't protect anyone from the storm.
That structural analogy works so well. Inward certainty must produce outward social equity. Without that balance, you either have hollow rituals that just serve the ego, or you have directionless activism that burns out because it lacks a deep philosophical anchor.
Okay, so if this message of absolute social equity and anti-hoarding was so obviously beneficial for the poor and the vulnerable, why did it trigger such a violent backlash?
Well, that's where the history comes in.
Right. To understand the urgency of this wisdom, we really have to look at the volatile world the original audience was living in, what was going on.
We have to imagine the original audience during the early Meccan period. They were a very small, heavily persecuted group. And Mecca wasn't just some random desert town. It was the religious and economic center of the entire region.
A hub.
The total hub.
Yeah.
The powerful tribal leaders, the Quraysh, they controlled the Kaaba, which at the time housed hundreds of idols representing different tribes.
And that brought in a lot of money, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
This drew massive pilgrimage traffic, which in turn drove the local economy. It was huge business.
So an attack on their polytheistic system was perceived as a direct attack on their economic monopoly and their societal power.
Yes.
By preaching absolute unity and demanding wealth distribution to the poor, this small group was threatening the entire geopolitical structure of the city.
Precisely. And they felt incredibly vulnerable, not just to internal persecution, but to massive external threats as well. The world they lived in was brutal. Well, this context is highlighted by a chapter titled The Elephant, which references a highly specific historical event from the year 570 CE.
Wait, the sources note this is the same year the Prophet of Islam was born, right?
Yes, exactly.
So what exactly was the year of the elephant?
The commentary provides this fascinating historical backdrop. An invading imperial army from Yemen, led by a Christian viceroy named Abraha, marched on Mecca, and they utilized war elephants.
War elephants? I mean, that would have been the ancient equivalent of rolling armored tanks into a society that only had, what, light cavalry?
Exactly. Guys on horses or camels. It was terrifying technology for the time.
But why did a Yemeni viceroy even care about Mecca? What was his angle?
It was entirely about economics and religious diversion. Abraha had built this magnificent cathedral in Yemen, and he wanted to divert the lucrative Arab pilgrimage and trade routes away from Mecca and down to his own territory in the south.
So it always comes back to the money.
Always. When the Meccans refused to divert their trade, he decided to just march on the Kaaba and destroy it completely.
So it's ancient geopolitics, economics, and religion all tied up together. But the text describes this massive, terrifying army being destroyed in a way that sounds, frankly, entirely surreal to a modern reader.
Oh, it does?
It says birds and flocks were sent to cast hard stones against the army, rendering them like straw eaten up.
Right, which highlights the profound sense of vulnerability felt by the original audience. They were intimately aware of how fragile their existence was.
Yeah, that they needed literal divine intervention.
Exactly. The story of the elephant served as a powerful historical reminder for this persecuted minority. Basically, if this sacred space could be protected from a massive imperial army and their war elephants by unforeseen forces, then this small community could also hope for deliverance from their powerful local oppressors.
But the opposition wasn't just nameless imperial armies or distant tribal leaders. It was coming from inside the house.
Yes, it was.
The conflict got incredibly personal, which brings us to a chapter titled The Flame. This chapter explicitly condemns a man named Abu Lahab, saying, "Perdition overtake both hands of the father of the flame."
Yeah, that's a very specific call out.
Who was Abu Lahab, and why is he singled out by name in a text that usually speaks in broad philosophical terms?
So Abu Lahab, which translates to father of flame or father of mischief, was actually a direct relative. He was an uncle of the prophet.
Oh, wow. An uncle?
Yeah. According to the historical notes in the sources, when the prophet first began to preach, he called his relatives together to warn them and deliver his message. And Abu Lahab fiercely rejected him right in front of everyone.
Just totally shut him down.
He shouted, "May you perish. Is it for this that you summoned us?" And from then on, he became one of the most bitter, violent opponents of the early movement, using his wealth and his massive influence to torture and starve the early believers.
Man, that adds such a heavy layer of grief to the text. It shows that this conflict wasn't just a political struggle. It was a deeply painful family fracture. It was a tearing apart of the basic social fabric of their lives.
It really underscored the severe cost of this message. Adhering to the absolute unity and the social equity demanded by the text meant alienating oneself from the power structures of the time, even if those structures were your own flesh and blood.
Which is devastating.
It is a stark reminder that speaking truth to power often comes with profound personal betrayal.
But the narrative arc of these chapters doesn't end in persecution, loneliness, and family betrayal, thankfully. There's a massive shift in the tides. The sources point us to a much later chapter titled The Help, which reflects a completely different historical reality.
Yes, this chapter reflects the moment of complete historical reversal. It speaks of the eventual conquest of Mecca, which occurred years later.
Things had totally changed by then.
Completely. The text says, "When there comes the help of Allah and the victory, and you see men entering the religion of Allah in companies."
So the movement went from a handful of persecuted outcasts to seeing massive crowds, entire tribes, adopting the new faith.
Exactly.
And here's what I find so compelling about this specific moment. You would expect a victory lap. You would expect a command to crush the remaining enemies, to take violent revenge for decades of torture, exile, and, the murder of their loved ones. Human nature practically demands a bloody retribution in a moment like that.
It does, and yet this raises a crucial point about the ethical framework of the text. Instead of vengeance, the victor is commanded in this chapter to celebrate the praise of your Lord and ask his forgiveness.
Not exactly a battle cry.
No, not at all. The commentary notes the immense magnanimity of the prophet in forgiving his deadliest foes at the hour of absolute triumph. It is a stunning injunction for humility and compassion at the exact moment when the ego usually demands ruthless retribution.
It's an incredible historical arc, but I want to push us to translate this.
Okay, let's do it.
Because it's intellectually interesting to see how an ancient desert society dealt with war elephants, tribal betrayals, and massive geopolitical shifts. But how do these ancient anxieties translate into the 21st century for you, the listener? Let's bring this into modern translation.
That's good.
I want to go back to the beginning, to that terrifying image of the crushing disaster, the al-hutama. The text says the slanderer and wealth hoarder will be hurled into this crushing disaster, which it defines as a fire kindled by Allah, which rises above the hearts.
And the translation of this concept is so vital for modern readers. The commentary in footnote 2098 explicitly states that because this fire is described as rising over the hearts, it implies that it is within the heart of man that the origin of this fire lies.
So it's internal.
Yes. A person's hell is thus within their own heart in this life.
Wait, I have to challenge this interpretation just a bit. Isn't that a massive leap? We are taking a 7th century religious warning about what appears to be literal hellfire and turning it into a psychological diagnosis for 21st century angst.
I get why you'd say that.
Like, how do we know we aren't just projecting our modern anxieties onto an ancient text to make it feel relevant?
It's a totally fair question, but the linguistic clues in the Arabic actually force a psychological reading, not just a physical one.
Really? How?
The text deliberately locates the fire over the hearts, which in ancient Arabic literature is the seat of desires, emotions, and intellect. The commentary elaborates that the extended columns of this fire arise from the inordinate desires in which man indulges, which, never being satisfied, become a source of torture for man in this life.
Oh, wow.
This isn't a modern projection. The commentators were noting centuries ago that insatiable greed creates a localized internal torment.
So it's literally describing the hedonic treadmill.
Exactly.
It's that phenomenon where you constantly chase wealth, you chase the promotion, you chase the status symbol, thinking it is your provision against mishap. You think, once I get this salary, I'll finally feel secure.
But you never do.
Right. The dopamine baseline just shifts. Because it's never enough, it creates a palpable burning anxiety right in the center of your chest. The fire isn't just a geographic location after death, it is the internal burnout and spiritual exhaustion of modern hustle culture.
That is an incredibly accurate mapping. The text suggests that the punishment for making material wealth your ultimate goal isn't just external judgment. The ambition itself becomes a self-inflicted torture. You become consumed by the very desires you thought would save you.
And the text directly links this internal fire to how we speak about others. Like, the chapter opens with a warning to every slanderer, defamer. And then later, we see Abu Lahab's wife metaphorically described as the bearer of slander, carrying firewood with a strongly twisted rope around her neck.
Yeah, that imagery is potent.
How does the ancient concept of carrying firewood to spread slander map onto today's communication?
Well, consider the mechanics of our digital landscape today. Slander, defamation, the spreading of rumors. This is the fundamental currency of cancel culture and internet outrage.
Oh, absolutely.
Abu Lahab's wife is described as the bearer of fuel, carrying the firewood of calumny and slander to spread evil reports. In modern terms, she represents the architecture of social media algorithms.
That is a fascinating parallel. The outrage algorithms are the modern firewood.
Exactly. They require constant fuel to keep the engagement high. In today's terms, anyone who participates in the casual destruction of another person's reputation online is carrying the kindling of gossip to burn down someone else's life.
But look at the consequence the text describes for her. Upon her neck, a halter of strongly twisted rope. The analogy is that spreading rumors to destroy others ultimately acts as a road around the slanderer's own neck.
Because it traps them.
Right. By participating in that toxic cycle of defamation, you don't just destroy your target, you strangle your own peace. You become hypervigilant, paranoid that the mob will turn on you next. You become trapped by the very toxicity you spread.
Which brings us to the absolute necessity of protecting yourself from that toxicity. This is brilliantly encapsulated in the chapter titled The Unbelievers.
Oh, I love this one.
Yeah, the text famously repeats a specific structure of disengagement. I do not serve that which you serve, nor are you going to serve him whom I serve. It concludes with the definitive statement, you shall have your recompense and I shall have my recompense, or as it's often translated, to you your way and to me mine.
When I read that, it sounded like a textbook script from a modern therapist on how to establish boundaries, but in its original context, it was highly political, right?
Yes. In its historical context, it was a definitive refusal by the prophet to compromise on core values. The Meccan leadership was offering him wealth, power, and inclusion if he would just validate their idols a little bit. A classic political compromise.
Just a little quid pro quo.
Right. And the text provided a hard boundary. There will be no blending of these fundamentally opposed systems.
It's the ultimate anti-gaslighting text. I mean, think about being in a toxic workplace or dealing with a manipulative family member who is trying to force you to accept their distorted version of reality.
We've all been there.
This chapter is the script for gracefully but firmly disengaging. It's saying, I see what you are doing, I see what you value, and I refuse to participate. You can walk your path and face the consequences of your path, but I am staying true to mine. It establishes an impenetrable boundary without initiating a war.
And that boundary is essential not just against external manipulators, but against internal ones as well.
Internal ones.
Yeah, because often the most dangerous threat to our peace is internal. This is where the final chapter, The Men, offers a profound psychological insight. It advises seeking refuge from the evil of the whisperings of the slinking devil who whispers into the hearts of men.
Let's dig into the Arabic word used there, because I know the translation of slinking devil sounds very medieval. What is the actual term and what does it imply?
The Arabic term is khannas.
Khannas.
Right. The commentary explains that khannas means one who holds back, shrinks, or hides himself. It refers to something that comes stealthily, retreats when confronted with truth, and casts evil suggestions into the hearts of men when they are unaware.
So it's not some guy with pitchforks and horns. Khannas is the perfect description of the inner critic.
Absolutely.
It's imposter syndrome. It's that insidious, slinking voice in your subconscious that waits until you're vulnerable and then whispers, "You aren't good enough," or "They're all laughing at you." It shrinks away when you actively challenge it with logic, but it slinks back the moment you're tired or stressed.
And if we expand that, the text says these whisperings come from among the jinn and the men. Even if a reader interprets jinn as unseen spiritual forces, in a modern psychological context, this represents the subtle societal pressures, the invisible cultural conditioning, the subliminal advertising that constantly whispers destructive ideas into our minds,
causing us to doubt our worth or our path.
Exactly. They are the unseen forces that manipulate our desires.
Knowing that this ancient text speaks so directly to modern anxiety, cancel culture, boundary setting, and our internal critics is illuminating. But understanding a text isn't enough. We have to know how to do something about it.
Theory into practice.
Right. How do we actually apply this ancient framework to our daily routines?
Well, this is where knowledge must become wisdom through application. Let's start with the concept of amun, those small household necessities we discussed earlier. We can frame this as a practical audit for the listener.
Okay, an audit. I like that. So if we apply this amun audit to our own lives, it forces a really uncomfortable philosophical question. Are we ignoring the mundane, unglamorous requests for help while patting ourselves on the back for our performative virtues?
It is a highly confronting question. The text suggests true character is not revealed on a resume. It's revealed in how we handle the interruptions of our day.
The interruptions, yeah.
When a junior colleague needs 10 minutes of your time to explain a concept they're struggling with, do you dismiss them harshly? Much like the text condemns treating the orphan with harshness.
Or when your partner asks you to take on an extra chore because they are exhausted, do you withhold that small act of service because you feel entitled to rest? So the practical challenge for you, the listener, is to audit your day. Are you hoarding the salt and water of human kindness? Find one small, entirely unglamorous way to be generous today that no one will ever applaud you for, and that you cannot post about on social media.
That's a great challenge. The next practical application deals with the internal landscape, specifically combating destructive emotions. A chapter titled The Dawn advises seeking refuge from the evil of the envier when he envies.
Usually when people read a line like that, the immediate reaction is, oh, I need to protect myself from the haters. People are jealous of my success.
Right, projecting it outward.
But I think the real practical application here is turning the mirror around. It's about guarding your own heart against the darkness of envying others.
That is the harder but much more necessary psychological work.
Yeah.
Envy is a corrosive emotion. It destroys the container that holds it long before it affects the target. This chapter starts by seeking refuge in the Lord of the Dawn.
The dawn. What's the significance of that?
Well, the commentary explains that the Arabic word falak signifies daybreak, meaning primarily the cleaving or splitting of the darkness.
I love that imagery. Here's a reflection for you. When you see someone else succeed, a friend gets a promotion, a peer gets recognized, someone buys a house you can't afford, what is your immediate internal reaction?
That's the real test.
Do you feel a cleaving of the darkness, like a genuine sense of light and joy for them? Or do you feel a knot of resentment tightening in your stomach? If you feel that knot of envy, you need to actively seek the dawn. You need to intentionally practice gratitude for your own path to split that darkness before the internal fire consumes you.
That's powerful. And finally, let's look at a practical application for the boundary setting chapter, where the text states, to you your way and to me mine. The practice here is identifying where in your life you are unnecessarily compromising your core values for the sake of artificial peace.
So, identify one area right now. It could be a toxic workplace dynamic where you're asked to cut ethical corners, a friendship that constantly drains your energy and demands you agree with their negativity, or even a harmful personal habit you're indulging in.
Yeah, it applies across the board.
Where do you need to clearly and definitively state, I am no longer participating in this? You don't have to be vindictive. You don't have to yell, but you have to be unbending. You have to practically step back and protect your spiritual center.
These practical steps sound empowering, but if we're intellectually honest as we analyze this text, modern readers will hit some serious friction when reading these chapters.
Oh, absolutely.
There are concepts here that are highly difficult for the modern mind to digest. Let's look at the obstacles to growth and why you might initially resist this material.
Yes, let's linger on the discomfort, because we shouldn't just gloss over the parts that offend our modern sensibilities. The first major obstacle is the starkness of the divine retribution. The imagery here is incredibly intense and, frankly, aggressive. In the chapter about the elephant, the enemies are rendered like straw eaten up, and then there's the literal cursing of Abu Lahab's hands, wishing for him to perish.
That's very direct.
I have to admit, as a modern reader, cursing a specific guy's hands to perish just sounds incredibly petty for a divine text. It sounds like a human losing their temper, not cosmic wisdom.
It's a jarring shift for a mind accustomed to modern therapeutic language. Modern sensibilities often prefer a spirituality that is, purely gentle and unconditionally affirming. We live in an era that emphasizes comfort and emotional safety.
Right.
So when a modern reader encounters a text that pronounces severe, unyielding judgment and uses the imagery of crushing disaster or personal ruin, the immediate reaction is to recoil. It feels harsh, perhaps even primitive.
So how do you justify it? How is cursing Abu Lahab not just an ancient grudge immortalized in text?
We have to understand the sheer scale of the systemic injustice being addressed. Abu Lahab wasn't just a guy who disagreed in a debate. He was a wealthy oligarch, utilizing his systemic power, his vast wealth, and his familial influence to violently crush a vulnerable minority.
He was an oppressor.
He was orchestrating the starvation and torture of people who were advocating for the poor and orphans. The text uses shocking, aggressive imagery not to be petty, but to jolt the reader awake.
You make a point about justice.
Yes. It forces us to acknowledge that extreme malice, systematic oppression, and the hoarding of wealth while neighbors starve are not minor character flaws that require gentle therapy. They are cosmic crimes that demand severe moral accountability. It's a demand for justice in a world that routinely lets the powerful off the hook.
Okay, I can see the argument for systemic justice, but another massive obstacle is the supernatural interpretations throughout the text.
Oh, definitely.
If you're a secular 21st century reader, you're going to bump hard into the chapter describing flocks of birds dropping stones to destroy an army, or the chapter talking about the evil of those who cast evil suggestions in firm resolutions, which the commentary links to literal witches blowing on knots. Or the references to unseen spirits, the jinn.
For a strict materialist worldview, these elements appear as folklore or myth. The temptation is to dismiss the entire text as a superstitious artifact.
Right.
If you cannot accept the literal existence of jinn or miraculous birds dropping stones, you might throw out the profound psychological insights regarding the ego and the inner critic right along with them.
And I think the third obstacle is the challenge of absolute certainty. The text operates on a strict binary of absolute truth regarding the divine. The boundary-setting chapter is a rigid, uncompromising refusal to blend beliefs.
Black and white.
Yeah. But we live in a postmodern era. We are actively taught to celebrate your truth and my truth. We value fluidity, moral relativism, and nuance. The rigid, unbending declarations of this ancient text can feel deeply alienating, intolerant, or inflexible to a modern learner who prefers gray areas.
So how do we bridge that gap? How do we find the enduring value in ideas that clash so sharply with our modern sensibilities?
That's the big question.
This requires reading the text not just on a superficial, literal level, but with careful, nuanced discernment. We have to separate the core wisdom from the historical packaging.
Let's do exactly that. Let's look at wisdom with discernment, starting with the supernatural elements. How do we extract the wisdom from the birds with stones destroying the elephant army? Are we required to believe in a supernatural avian air force to get the point?
Not necessarily. The commentary provides a vital key here. It notes that while the text poetically mentions birds casting stones, early historical commentators actually attributed the sudden destruction of the army to a virulent outbreak of smallpox or pestilence.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah. The text's description of the soldiers' bodies becoming like straw eaten up perfectly matches the devastating physical effects of such highly contagious diseases, which cause the flesh to blister and decay rapidly.
So Whether you view this as a literal supernatural miracle where birds bombed an army, or as a poetic theological description of a sudden epidemic that decimated invaders, the enduring wisdom remains exactly the same.
Exactly. The core wisdom is that immense human arrogance, military might, and imperial ambitions are ultimately fragile. They are subject to forces completely beyond their control.
Right. Nature, disease, whatever it may be.
The Yemeni viceroy thought his massive war elephants made him a god, but his invincible army was undone by the microscopic by a sudden, unforeseen disease. The lesson in profound humility stands, regardless of your view on the supernatural mechanics of the event.
And if we apply that same discernment to the unseen elements, the jinn and the knot blowers, we can psychologize the unseen. Even if a listener doesn't believe in literal witches tying knots and string and blowing on them to cast spells, the psychological reality of what that represents is undeniable in modern relationships.
The Arabic phrase, for those who blow on knots, relates to those who secretly weaken one's resolutions or plant doubt. Think about how often we face unseen negative influences.
All the time.
We have people in our lives whose words act exactly like spells, manipulative comments, gaslighting, passive-aggressive critiques that literally tie our minds in knots of confusion and despair. They blow doubt onto our firm resolutions.
And the jinn can represent the unseen cultural forces, the subconscious biases, the hidden algorithms designed to addict and enrage us. These are very real, invisible forces that manipulate our behavior every single day.
Yes, exactly.
So, when the text tells us to seek refuge in the Lord of the Dawn, it is providing a powerful metaphor for actively seeking the light of reason, higher truth, and spiritual clarity to break those psychological chains and untie those mental knots.
When we decode the text this way, using discernment, we begin to realize that this ancient Arabian wisdom isn't isolated. It's participating in a much larger global conversation about the human condition. We can see comparative insights that link these specific chapters to other great wisdom traditions across the world.
Let's explore those connections. Think about the universal whisperer. We talked about the khanas, the slinking devil that whispers in the hearts of men. You see this exact same psychological archetype in Buddhism with the concept of Mara, the demon who tried to distract the Buddha with illusions, doubts, and appeals to the ego.
Or in modern secular psychology, this is simply the concept of the ego, the voice of fear, separation, and pride that constantly chatters in our minds, trying to keep us small, reactive, and afraid. The battle against internal deception, the struggle to silence the whisperer and find true consciousness, is a universally recognized human struggle. The text is just giving it a specific, highly poetic framework.
And what about the ethics of wealth? The fierce condemnation of wealth hoarding and the demand to care for the orphan and provide the small necessities. This isn't just an Arabian concept. This is the golden rule of wealth.
You find this exact same fierce ethical demand in the teachings of the biblical prophets, like Amos or Isaiah, who railed against the rich, crushing the poor, and ignoring the widow.
Yeah, that theme is everywhere.
You find it in modern socioeconomic critiques of extreme wealth inequality, too. The foundational idea that the ethical validity of a society or an individual is judged strictly by how it treats its most marginalized members transcends the specific theology of this text. It is a universal moral imperative.
I also see an incredibly strong connection to Stoicism. Look at the boundary setting chapter again. You shall have your recompense and I shall have my recompense. This is practically the Stoic dichotomy of control wrapped in 7th century poetry.
It is a remarkable parallel. Both traditions teach the absolute necessity of recognizing what is outside your sphere of control, which includes the beliefs, the actions, and the toxic behaviors of others.
You can't control them.
You cannot force them to change their path, and trying to do so only destroys your own peace.
But you can fiercely guard what is within your control. Your own integrity, your own reactions, and your own spiritual center. Let them be them, but you must fiercely protect you.
So, if we synthesize this entire journey, we've traveled across a vast and complex landscape today.
We really have.
We started with the historical, physical defense of a sacred space against war elephants, but we've moved inward to understand that the ultimate battle is the internal defense of the human heart. It is the defense against the whispering forces of our own envy, our boundless greed, our negative self-talk, and our failure to extend basic, small kindnesses to those around us.
The text tells us that the greatest danger isn't an external army marching on our city. The greatest danger is the fire of dissatisfaction and greed kindled in our own chests. The question is, how do we put it out?
That is the question.
So here's a final thought for you to mull over as you go about your day, building on what we've explored. If the fire of burnout and anxiety is fueled by the constant pursuit of the self, the only water that can extinguish it is the radical turn toward the other. What small necessaries, what alanon of time, patience, or resources can you share today to extinguish that fire of anxiety in yourself and bring a little bit of the dawn to someone else?
That's a beautiful thought to end on.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.